What's up, ladies, gentlemen, people, extraterrestrial aliens and everything in between? Today I'm going to be moving away from the very top of the Overwatch Pro scene, and instead we'll be looking more at Tier 2, the best contenders team of all time in every region. I'm gonna be going through all 5 of the contenders regions one by one and discussing the best teams, and then narrowing it down to the best of the best from that region, to be considered the best team of all time from a region. It really comes down to 2 factors: one, that your team has won at least multiple titles in that region, and 2, that a sizable amount of talent from that team has made it to the Overwatch League. The only exception to that second part is Australia, who, speaking of, let's start with them because no one really cares about them lol. I still feel like I need to talk about them though, even though at this point Australian contenders is kind of just a joke. 2020 Australian contenders especially was just tomfoolery, to say the least, but looking at the very unrecognized scene as a whole, I'd say it comes down to 3 teams, those being Sydney Drop Bears, Ground Zero Gaming, and Dire Wolves. Sydney Drop Bears for having 3 of the only Australian players to have ever touched the league, those being Punk, Color Hex and Drill. Punk most notable of course, as he is very well respected by the community for doing what he did on Boston the past few years, along with Korean player Dreamer who made it to the league as well, and for their success in 2018 and early 2019. Ground Zero Gaming make a case for being at least somewhat relevant the past 3 years, winning some titles here and there, along with the good amount of talent they've had over the years. Dreamer as a player and a coach, along with former player and now well-respected coach Hunter Adam, who has a lot of talent and made it to the league, only to get screwed over twice. God, I feel so bad for him. And Opener, who managed to make his way over to the league to the Justice. And Dire Wolves make a case for having Color Hex and for their pretty consistent success over the past 2 years. Also no, I will not be talking about Mind Freak, because they just trolled their way to victory in 2020, so who wins out of these 3 teams? They all make a good case. Well, at least for me, I'm gonna go with Ground Zero as my best Australian team of all time. The issue with the other 2 is that Sydney Drop Bears haven't been in contenders since June 2020, and Dire Wolves have only had 1 player get carried over to the league, and it was Color Hex, who needs no explanation. I know that isn't saying much because it's Australia, but still, Ground Zero, however, they've won a pretty good amount of titles, and have had a few Overwatch League talents as I mentioned before. If Dire Wolves had more players in the league, I'd probably give it to them considering they have more titles, but it's Australia, so no one really cares that much, so Ground Zero wins for a mixture of most recent success, league-level talents, even though half of them were Korean in the Australian region, which is kind of funny, and the most prize money of these 3. Moving on to an actually relevant region, let's talk about the best Tier 2 team of all time in China. And I mean, this one is pretty easy to determine. Before I actually say who it is, I want to start with a few honorable mentions. Flagship Recreators for not losing a single map in the Summer Series 8 sides, and for just overall being dominant in 2022. Team Chaser and Bilibili for their success and amazing rivalry in 2021. Bilibili would always be better in the regular season, but when it came down to the tournament finals, Team Chaser would always come up clutch, and all the talent that was brought to life on those teams: Alpha E, Pineapple, X-Ray, Irony, Late Young, Yuval. I'm probably missing a few, but you get the point. Bilibili also deserve huge credit for discovering Shy, a lesser talked about team who I think deserves some spotlight is Flag Gaming for that one huge upset against you-know-who in the finals of Season 2 of 2020. That final still holds up as one of the greatest contenders games of all time in my opinion. I watched the whole thing real time, it was amazing. It also shined light on insane talent. A Priter, C-Wave, Monk, 800. These guys are all big names in the Chinese scene. Moving to pre-COVID Chinese dynasties were LGE Hua, who won both titles in 2019 and brought in great talent like Molly, Lengza, J-Mac, Piggy and most notably Merit. And the final honorable mention is a team who dominated the Chinese scene in 2018, winning 2 of the 3 seasons, anticlimactically with an all-Korean roster though. I'm talking about Lucky Future Zenith. 5 of their 6 starting lineup made it to the league. Erster DM Marvel Michelle and IDK all came from this team, but with all those honorable mentions out of the way, it's time to get to the cream of the crop, and I mean, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Team CC was obviously the best Chinese team of all time. I mean, look at these results, gold all around. Before we get into the meat of their success, I want to briefly talk about 2019, where despite only finishing second in Season 2, this team was first able to bring Fearless back into the league and prove to everyone why the 040 season was not on him. So after he's back on the main team, Team CC bring in an influx of new talent, one of which is Dia, another player wanting to prove that the 040 season was not on him, and boy did he prove that. 2020 may have been a terrible year for everything else, but it was a damn good year for Overwatch contenders. This team rose from the ashes and dominated literally everyone, while everyone was playing Double Shield or some other boring comp. Team CC was playing to their strengths. They didn't care what the meta was, they wanted to play what worked for them, and boy did it pay off. We all remember that signature ball comp of theirs, Dia on Ashe, Innovation on Tracer, Gaga on Ball, Ligue on Sigma, Super Rich on Mercy, and Farway on Zen. It was a very off-meta comp at the time, but they played it so well that other teams started to discover that Ball wasn't just a stall pick. Their ball comp was so strong that it carried over into the Overwatch League in 2021. Despite the Tier 1 version of the comp being a little different, the main foundations of the comp were still there, and it was all because of this one team, who made the entire competitive world of this game realize how powerful a wrecking ball strategy could be in the right hands, and along the way they found tons of success. Just look at how many wins they had in 2020, almost 0 losses to be found, and apparently they were scrimming the main team Shanghai Dragons a lot during 2020, and from what I've heard they were pretty well matched. Think about that, the Tier 1 Shanghai Dragons, the best team in APAC and arguably the best team in the league at the time, was struggling to defeat their own academy team. That is insane. And it's poetic too, because just 1 year later the Dragons would use their own Tier 2 strategy to win the league. Very cool story if you think about it, and I'm not even finished yet. At the end of 2020, despite having a small shortcoming versus Flag Gaming and their influx of newly discovered talent, they didn't let it break them. The 2020 gauntlet was just 1 month later, and for the first and currently only time in Overwatch history, Korea did not win in an international Overwatch contenders tournament. We've seen it time and time again. The 2019 gauntlet, most recently in the Pacific Showdown tournament, Korea always wins, but not this time. Team CC made history by beating Gen.G in the gauntlet finals 4-1. They were truly on top of the world, and obviously this led to a lot of eyes being drawn from Overwatch League teams. Hear this, the entire Team CC roster would eventually get picked up. In Season 4 Gaga and Farway went to the Chengdu Hunters, and Ligue A would go to the Hangzhou Spark, and while the other half of the team stayed on CC or went inactive, they all got picked up eventually. Dia and Innovation would go to the Valiant in 2022. And Super Rich would go to the Spark in 2022, well technically not all of them found a team, at least not yet. I forgot to talk about Spectre, who was also a super talented guy on this roster in 2020 and 2021, hoping he finds a team because he's super talented as well on heroes like Echo. Most notably, after the legendary year of 2020, Team CC decided to move to Korea, where they still managed to find success. I'm not going to go into too much detail since we're discussing China, but they discovered some great hidden talent over there. most notably Someone and Easy Han, but now unfortunately, the team has disbanded for good. But we can all be very thankful for what this team did for the Chinese scene, after how much the Season 1 Dragons hurt the Chinese scene of professional Overwatch. It was amazing to see how the exact same organization could bring so much life straight back into it. This team, with their dominant showings, upsets, and ability to literally redefine the meta around their strengths, was able to give help to Chinese Overwatch once again. Teams started to actually be interested in signing Chinese players, Tier 1 and Tier 2, and although in the present day there still isn't a huge need for Chinese talent, it's still much greater than what it used to be, all thanks to this one team. Now for EU contenders, and this is another one that should come as no surprise, but again I'd like to go over some honorable mentions first. First is Oblivion, who are currently by far the best EU team in 2022 and are currently on a massive win streak, almost 30 I believe, and Falcon Esports, who were relatively dominant in 2021 for their short history, but neither of those teams had any players join the league. Only player from either team to make it to the league was Psycho, who was dropped after just one stage. He wasn't very good. Pre-COVID days I'd say another candidate would be Team Gigante, who birthed pretty much all of the Finnish talent this league has ever seen. Linkzer, Big Goose, Shaz, LH Cloudy, Mazza, Froggy, RCK, Reaper, Zuppe, Zappis, all came from that team, but they also won a few titles in 2017 and 2018. But there is no clearer choice here than the Empire, who held a monopoly over this region for an entire year. British Hurricane, the academy team of the London Spitfire. Let's start from the very beginning of their existence, 2018. This 2018 roster had some big names, the biggest of which being Funny Astro, so that's first thing. This team jump-started Funny Astro's career, which would turn out to be one of the best ever from an EU player. But they also had some other big names on the team, like famous Tracer player and streamer Craigie Kib, who had a short career in the Overwatch League during Season 2 on the Charge and Fusion, and Fusions, who went on to be the best British main tank for a while and made it to the league on the Boston Uprising. They were able to win the first season of 2018 European contenders and defeat the previous champions, the previously mentioned Team Gigante. They didn't really do much the rest of the year, but that was enough for them. 2019 they finished second in Season 1, but after that not much else. Still, however, they were always in the upper half of EU contenders the rest of the year, but 2020 was the year where this team really asserted themselves as the kings of this region. They went on the longest win streak in Contenders history and the second longest win streak in Overwatch esports history at a whopping 43 wins in a row. That is insane. They won all the titles, had all the talent, there was no stopping them, the team just played so well together, and they literally did not lose for the first 10 months of 2020, not until a Bay Alliance was finally able to put a stop to them at the end of Season 2 on November 22nd, they were stacked. It was the first time in forever it felt like where people genuinely believed in an all-European team to have Overwatch League level success. The team consisted of Sparkar, Daned, Hardy, Molfig, Reaper, and Jofi, who was later replaced by Kellex. Two of those guys had already been in the league before. Reaper was mostly a bench player on the Gladiators in 2019, and Kellex had played for the Uprising in Seasons 1 and 2 and for the Toronto Defiant in the first half of 2020, neither of which had much success. But once they joined this all-European super team, they reached the very peak of their Overwatch careers. 2020 for this team also ended with a bang. It was the gauntlet time for them, and they were looking to take it all. They yet again dominated their way through all the other EU teams, only dropping a single map the whole way through to the finals. Granted, the EU gauntlet was a joke, and Hurricane were pretty much the only ones taking it seriously, but still, they made it to the finals where they faced off against their destined rivals, American Tornado, who we will discuss later, and well, They fought long and hard, but they eventually fell short 4-3 in one of the greatest contenders matches of all time. Damn, 2020 really was a great year for contenders, so 2020 was over, and after the pretty miserable year the London Spitfire had in 2020, they decided to promote the entire 2020 British Hurricane roster, except for Sparker, who would join halfway through the year due to being underage, and Dan Ed. Missing out on Dan Ed was a huge question mark for a lot of people, and it ended up backfiring very heavily. While this may not have been the reason why, the 2021 London Spitfire, despite having so much promise with all these EU superstars, was nothing more than a disappointment, going from the longest win streak in contenders history to 1-15 in the Overwatch League. It's pretty safe to say that this team disappointed, and yet again proved the haters right that EU talent doesn't usually translate to Overwatch League level success. Thankfully though, the 2021 Eternal proved these doubters somewhat wrong, and the 2022 Spitfire, which made tons of upgrades, also ended up doing pretty well. But back to British Hurricane, 2021 rolled around and they were still a top-tier team in the scene. They weren't the empire they once were, but the influx of new talent they got proved to still be very good at the EU contenders level. They were able to win Season 1 of EU contenders and finish top 4 in all the other tournaments the rest of the year, meaning they were still like a top 3 team in EU contenders, but they weren't the same. Still though, the 2021 British Hurricane roster still had some really talented players. Admiral, their main support, would be promoted to the main team and proved to be an upgrade over Kellex, and Sky Reaper was signed to the Titans. And guys like Helv and Yikids, despite not getting signed to a team, were both very talented as well, and through it all, Sparker was always there. 2020 and 2021 before he turned 18, this man was always carrying the Hurricane. His hits and heroes were absolutely out of the world, some of the best EU talent the world of Overwatch has ever seen. His Cassidy, Tracer, Ashe, Hanzo, Widow, Sim, and Sojourn were just ridiculous, and Hardy is another guy to mention from this team who found success, winning the Dennis Havelka Award in 2022 and having one of the greatest redemption stories in league history, going from 1-15 and one of the worst main tanks in the league in 2021, to the best Rhine in the league and looking like he was back in his 2020 Hurricane prime again. Wrapping this segment up though, since we gotta keep moving. Despite maybe not translating to a ton of league success, the British Hurricane Empire will always be remembered as the greatest European contenders team of all time, with their undefeated win streak, and as the team who somehow managed to have more prize money than a few Overwatch League teams at the time. This next one is gonna be maybe a bit more difficult to decide. North America. We have a few candidates here, those being Fusion University, Atlanta Academy, Odyssey, Redbird, and American Tornado. A few other teams like Second Wind, Envy, Revival, Third Impact, and Team Dog are also up there, but those guys really only had success like once or twice. These 5 teams had lots of success over a good stretch of time. Going through all the teams I just mentioned, they all make a good case. Going in chronological order, Fusion Uni were by far the best in the early years, winning all 3 seasons of 2018 North American Contenders, along with Season 1 in 2019 on North America East sides, and also in 2019 they won the Atlantic Showdown between both North America sides. That 2018 roster consisting of the GOAT Alarm, Rest in Peace, Beast Halo, Burner, Elk, Who Are You, and Zachary, would all eventually make it to the league, with varying levels of success, and although the 2019 team replaced most of it with new talents, those being Neist, Snillo, Kaka and Changsik, the team was still pretty dominant throughout the first half of 2019, but after a pretty unsuccessful attempt to try and start a berth in Korean contenders, Fusion Uni disbanded, until 2 years later when it came back to meme on all the VU while Astro, Poco and Shockwave were waiting for their visas, but we don't talk about that. Next team to talk about was the team who took over the scene for the second half of 2019, I'm of course talking about Atlanta Academy, the same team who had the infamous Ajax, but we also don't talk about that. This was a team who came out of left field. After finishing second twice in the last 2 seasons, they moved over to the eastern side of North America and immediately scared everyone, winning Season 2 of North American East Contenders, and making the way over to the Gauntlet, where they really made a name for themselves. They took down 2 of the Korean super teams, Runaway and Gen.G, both of which were considered top teams, of course since they were Korean, but this Atlanta Academy team steamrolled their way to the finals, not dropping a single map, until they fought Element Mystic, the second time, and despite making it competitive, they fell short in the finals. But they had accomplished plenty along the way to feel proud of. The team then disbanded after a failed attempt to start up another run in early 2020, but the roster they created was still stacked. This team had Gator and Hawk, the famous duo who would be promoted in 2020 to find great success just 1 year later in 2021. They had Saucy, who was really good at the time and was promoted once he came of age in late 2020. But was unfortunately misused and wasted. Rip to him. Sugar Free, who was an absolutely astonishing flex player who took a break but was now recently signed to the Titans. Kodak, who was also promoted to Atlanta in 2020, didn't really do much but still, and Funny Astro, who as we all know found great success down the line with Fusion and Glads. That team was stacked, but getting into the more recent stuff. The first half of 2020 saw a few teams be at the top of the food chain, but none were super dominant. There was no team head and shoulders above the rest, until American Tornado came along. They swept up all the good players, and dominated pretty much everyone. More recently though, late 2021 and 2022, Redbird and Odyssey have been in a pretty intense rivalry for the title of Best in NA. Both have great talent and have won all the recent titles, having top players like Vega, CJ, Rhino, Tree, Gig, Luke Mino, Rack Attack, and Vulcan. But I'm not gonna beat around the bush any longer. Out of these teams, I just need to give it to American Tornado, the third 2020 super team to win the title of greatest of all time in their respective region. I know they didn't win as many big titles like Fusion Uni did, aside from the Gauntlet and a few in 2021, but their story and talent is enough to compensate for me. This team was scrapped together in the middle of the year, and basically pulled themselves out of their own asses, and immediately started to dominate everyone they touched, only losing 4 matches ever in Contenders. Mind you, a lot of these guys were 16 years old at the time. For that reason Hydran wasn't allowed to play, which is why they had to sign Wub to fill in for him. They went under the name Tier 2 Drama Alert Nation before switching to American Tornado to fit the role of British Hurricanes rival, and they were rivals. When they met up in the 2020 Gauntlet Finals, it was glorious, a 7-map banger that somehow, someway, American Tornado managed to win. A team scrapped together in the middle of the year, from guys who were so young they couldn't play in the league till at least 1 year later, managed to defeat the nearly undefeated British Hurricane. Now that is a story. Talking about the roster, they had Reiner and Coolidge, who were both from the original GOATS roster, Hydran, Wub, Speedily and I believe Sugar Free, as well as Damage Dealers, and OG and Ultraviolet as their backline. This team was stacked, from top to bottom, and everyone knew that once those guys were league ready in future years, they would dominate, and so they did. All of those guys eventually got signed to the league. In 2021 this team continued to dominate. Although they lost Coolidge, they quickly replaced him with Falls, and got a few more pieces like Aspire. Iced. This team was still dominant, crushed everyone, yet they did come up short in Season 1, losing to Revival, 4-3, another all-time great contenders game. By the way, I just want to talk about that team real quick. They were a super fun team to watch as well. They had Seeker, Cloudy, Lep and Rupaul. Anyways, back to Tornado. They instantly made up for it though by winning the next 3 months of North American contenders pretty dominantly, before suddenly being disbanded. What a story. Another crazy part about this team is that every single one of them except for Iced would eventually make it to the Overwatch League with varying levels of success. Rhino to the Gladiators where he became a all-star, Kaluj and Sam to the Shock where they made it to the Grand Finals, False Aspire and Sugar Free to the Titans where Aspire would carry. False was put on Winston and sadly misused, and Sugar Free is looking to be a top upcoming rookie. Speedily UV and OG all went to the Rain, Hydran went to the Mayhem, Wob to the Eternal, and yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that if all of your tier 2 roster except one guy made it to the league, you can be considered the best. They may have been the most short-lived team on this list, but they still left their mark on North American contenders and all of contenders forever. And finally, we've made it to the final region, home to a majority of the talent scene at the top level of Overwatch, along with a lot of other games. I'm of course talking about Korea. This one was a tough choice. There have been so many amazing Korean super teams over the years in Tier 2, Talon, T1, Batlika, GEC Busan Wave, X6, WGS Phoenix, Kongdu Panthera, Gen.G. I'm probably missing a few names but you get the idea. There have been a flood of top-tier Korean contenders teams over the years, but there are 3 that I feel have stood head and shoulders above the rest: O2 Blast, Runaway, and Element Mystic. These 3 have won many titles, had many of their entire rosters been signed to the Overwatch League without hesitation, and overall these 3 have just left the most impact on the scene as a whole in my opinion. Let's start with Runaway. After the final season of Apex was over, this team decided to move its way over to Korean contenders in 2018, waiting until an Overwatch League team would be willing to sign their whole roster, and during this time, they really made a name for themselves, winning Season 2 of Korean contenders that year 4-3 against Kongdu Panthera, in another one of the all-time best contenders games, in my opinion the best GOATS game of all time, and beating the World Cup champion team South Korea in a show match. By the end of 2018 they were the most highly sought out rookies, but as I said before, they all wanted to play together, so they waited for a team to sign them all, and so that happened. A team called the Vancouver Titans picked up their entire roster, consisting of Hawksel, Somenshu, Stitch, Hurrig, Bumper, Jonu, Twilight, and Slime. This roster went into the Overwatch League and it's pretty safe to say they were one of if not the best team throughout 2019, only losing 6 games that whole year. The core just had so much synergy it was insane, and that was especially helpful during GOATS. But back to Runaway, they go into 2019 with a completely different look, but one that was still deadly. The new core they picked up in 2019, consisting of Hisu, Shui, Mag, QOQ, Lee Jae-gon, Gangnam Jin, and later Yaki would join as well. This team was almost as stacked as the 2018 Super Team, and they continued to win titles, in GOATS, and in the Brawley May Reaper Double Shield metas that followed. To list the titles they won Season 3 of 2018 contenders in early 2019 against Element Mystic 4-1, fell a little short in the semi-finals against O2 in Season 1 of 2019, but made up for it by winning Season 2 of 2019 against Element Mystic yet again, this time 4-2. This is all not including third-party tournaments by the way, because they won a lot of those NetEase titles as well. Anyways, they did fall a little short in the gauntlet though to the red-hot Atlanta Academy, but still, they had a very successful year and their whole roster would eventually get picked up by pro teams in 2020. This time they didn't all stay together though. Yaki and Gangnam Jin would go to the Florida Mayhem, Shui to the Spitfire, Hesia to the Fusion, and Lee Jae gone to the Dragons, QOQ would join a Spark team in need of another off-tank halfway through the year, and Mag wouldn't be league eligible until after Season 3, where he would join the Washington Justice for Season 4. Most of these guys ended up finding success right after being on Runaway. The only one who really crashed and burned was Shui, but the 2020 Spitfire disaster wasn't necessarily his fault. The rest of them though, Heesu and Jaegon made top 4 in 2020, Yaki and Gangnam Jin led Mayhem to their best season in franchise history, and QOQ helped the Spark not go out completely flopping. But back to Runaway, their 2020 roster was also quite stacked. While they didn't win any titles, they finished second in both seasons and made both finals competitive. This team had Merit, Assassin, FaZe, Mag as previously mentioned, Chio, and Revenge. Most of these guys would go on to other teams to find more success, and most of them went to an Overwatch League team eventually. However, at the end of 2020 in the Gauntlet, they yet again choked at third due to unfortunate circumstances, with the Washington Justice having snatched up their main tank player Mag. They were left in a situation where they'd have to run 2 off-tank players in a meta that didn't necessarily favor it, yet still, they managed to finish third and made it super competitive. Their Hog Sigma and Ball comps weren't bad, and the team still looked good. However, after the first half of 2021 was kind of a mess, the team was mid for the first time in forever and were putting up their worst performances in franchise history. They eventually decided it would be for the best to disband in June of 2021. Still though, this team left their mark as one of the greatest contenders teams of all time, fueling so many league-level talents to eventually make it to the top level. So for that, they will always be remembered. But now we have to talk about our second team, Element Mystic. These guys did some crazy stuff throughout their history. They started out their runs in third-party tournaments, where they were super successful. This was also the team who started Fearless on his legendary career, but he was off the team before they joined Contenders. Just thought I would point that out though. Anyways, they joined the scene in early 2018. And despite not being the very best of the best at first, their team still had a lot of talent. They finished top 4 in Season 2 and were competitive the whole way through. Their team consisted of Sparkle Garden XZ as DPS, Pokepo and Dorko as tanks, and Jex and Repel as supports. This team wasn't the best in GOATs, but they would typically go off meta and play to the strengths of their DPS, which worked most of the time, but not against the top GOATs teams at the time like Runaway. Still though, their team was talented, and Overwatch League teams recognized that, which is why a majority of their team would be signed to the league, all of which probably would have been signed if it weren't for XZ and Sparkle being too young. Pokepo and Dorko would go to the Atlanta Rain as their tank line. Guard would go to the Spitfire as a solid third DPS option behind Prophet and Birdring. Jex would go to the Dynasty as a backup to Toby, and Repel would go to the Titans as a backup to Twilight. You see the pattern here. Although most of them were just secondary options, the fact that teams recognized their talent to begin with was good enough for a lot of these guys. Even though they didn't have the most successful year, 2019 though, is where they really picked up steam. They picked up Takoyaki, Hanbin, Doha, and Unique to make up for their lost guys. However, they didn't sign MCD and Undyne as flex supports until a little later in the season, which meant that for the start of 2019, XZ had to play Zen, which was pretty funny, but they made the most of it. But once they picked up steam, this team was top tier. During GOATs, despite not being the best GOATs team, they won Season 1 of Korea, and the Pacific Showdown, both finals against O2. During this time they pulled out their signature Hackfist comp, which shook the world because of how well it worked. Sombra and Doomfist in a GOATs meta was strange, but it worked, and they continued to run Doha on that signature Sombra of his and used it to great effect. Then later that year they won the Gauntlet in the double shield meta, yet again running some Hackfist, but Doom in general was a comfort pick for them. That's where Sparkle made a name for himself, on that Doomfist role, just dominating everyone on that hero, even if it wasn't meta, and as a result, a lot of these guys were signed to the Overwatch League, most notably of course Sparkle XZ Hanbin and head coach Rush, all going to the Paris Eternal, where they helped that team be arguably the most surprising dark horse team of all time. Along with this, Doha went to the Dallas Fuel, where Sparkle, Hanbin and Rush would all eventually join him as well. MCD would wait a year before going to the Spark, and Takoyaki and Unique would both also eventually make it to the league, but neither of them were really at peak form when they joined the league. Back to Element Mystic though, this was unfortunately where their reign of terror ended. They were still like an upper half team in 2020, and finished 4th in the Gauntlet, but they were nothing super special. Their time at the very top of the contenders hierarchy was over. However, the 2020 roster did still have talent, a lot of which would go on to other contenders teams and eventually to the league. A few names you might recognize are Kellen, MN3, Heesang, Vigilante, Onsoon J, and Choice A1. Although some of these are big names, they weren't that big at the time, and they disbanded before the 2021 season even started. So yeah, Element Mystic, they had their time in the spotlight, had a ton of talent that would go to the Overwatch League, and they overall make a really good case. But no one can overtake the team who I have at number 1. This team has been around since the very beginning. They've won titles, and they've had a plethora of players make it to the league. Every season players from this team make it to the Overwatch League, and I am of course talking about the one, the only, O2 Blast. This team not only is the greatest Korean contenders team of all time, but quite possibly the greatest contenders team of all time, period. Let's start from the very beginning of their history in Korean contenders. They were around in 2017 for bits and pieces, but they really took off in 2018, where they finished second in the first ever season of Korean contenders, right behind X6 Gaming. And although they didn't do nearly as good the rest of the year, they still had a very talented roster. Some names you might know from that roster that made it to the league are Ivy, Stella, Yakpung, Rain, and of course, Violet. Yes, the GOAT of support himself, Violet, was on that original O2 roster, and he sure as hell popped off considering he would win back-to-back championships after O2 with the shock. The rest of the guys I just mentioned went to the Defiant and weren't super successful, but nonetheless still did make a name for themselves, except for Rain of course, who would go on to the Mayhem and Valiant later on. Moving on to 2019 though, this is where the team starts to catch momentum. Their new roster consisted of Proper, Pelican, Kaiser, Krong, Mandu, and Myeonbong. Now this roster obviously has some big names on it, and they performed super well in GOATs, finishing second to Element Mystic in both Season 1 and the Pacific Showdown, and finishing 4th in Season 2, but unfortunately not making the Gauntlet. Despite still not having any titles to their name after their first 2 years, the team was still near the top, and that was evident by the fact that half their lineup ended up in the Overwatch League by Season 3, Myeonbong went to the Uprising, Mandu to the NYXL, and Krong to the Charge. Despite the first 2 of which not finding much success, Krong ended up being an MVP candidate and one of if not the best Sigmas in the league that year. Back to O2 though, they continued to be near the top of Korean contenders in 2020, signing some new pieces to go alongside their DPS line of Proper and Pelican, those new pieces being Yakpung returning to the team, Kalios, Tieru, Finn, and Neko. Kilo would also join the team later into the season, and 2020 was a really good year for this team. They won their first title in franchise history against Runaway 4-2 in the Season 1 finals. June of 2020, Proper's Ash and Echo during Season 1 of 2020 were out of this world, and would foreshadow what would eventually come to be. Pelican's May was also insane. Diffing Runaway was a big accomplishment, but unfortunately they took a little dip in their performance from there, not even finishing top 4 in Season 2. and due to some unfortunate complications with Neko, during the Gauntlet Pelican would have to play Brig and they had to run Tiru and Kilo in the second DPS slot instead, and despite putting up a good fight, it unfortunately wasn't enough to get them to the Gauntlet finals, but O2 still achieved a lot that year. A lot of their players ended up getting signed for Season 4 of the Overwatch League, most notably of course Pelican going to the Atlanta Reign and becoming the Rookie of the Year with his stellar Echo and May play. The tank line of Yakpung and Kalios went to the NYXL, Tiru would go to the Titans and Neko would move to a coaching role on the charge. Although none of these guys except Pelican really found much success in Season 4, the talent was still stacking up. All had come from O2. Flora as well is a guy who was a backup in 2019, he was in the league in 2021 as well and looked super good. Another really talented player from O2 who made it to the league, just wanted to point that out. Anyways, back to O2, 2021 is where this team asserted themselves. This was the year where people really started to consider them in the GOAT conversation for contenders teams. The team kept proper Kilo and Finn from last season, and picked up tons of new talents, Vindame, Max, Junbin, and a ton of other backups like Ho1 and Sanguinar. They later on also picked up FaZe Merit and Cheer from the runaway team that had disbanded. This team was dominant. These guys and Talon Esports had pretty much all the best Korean players that weren't already in the league, and they won back-to-back seasons of Korean contenders in 2021, both finals against Talon, and at the center of it all, was Proper, the man, the myth, the legend, who after dominating the entire scene with his Tracer play among other heroes, he decided to join the Shock with fellow teammates Kilo and Finn, where he would, as we all know, dominate, be the first player in history to win Rookie of the Year and MVP in the same season, and arguably had the best single season we've ever seen out of a player. Insane stuff from that man on O2 and on Shock, on so many different heroes, pretty much every DPS hero you can think of. He hard carried on it, and shortly after Shock bought O2 Blast, and from there it's just sky high and beyond for this team. The rest of the team except the tank line also made it to the league in 2022, Chio went to the Dallas Fuel, Vindame to the Seoul Dynasty, Merit to the Houston Outlaws, although to the Toronto Defiant, Ho1 to the NYXL, they were all getting signed. Meanwhile the guys who were still on O2 like Junbin and Max were still absolutely popping off in contenders during the summer series, and run it back tournaments. The team also brought along new top-tier talents, such as Hesang, Probe, Viper, Prophet, Bliss, and Babel. The talent coming from this team was just absolutely flooding, and Hesang and Max most recently just got picked up by the main team, the Shock. And considering that the minimum league age requirement has now been lowered to 17, it's pretty safe to say that most if not all of those guys I just mentioned will find a team in the Overwatch League, a third of which already has. Bliss, he's on the Dallas Fuel I'm pretty sure, nothing confirmed yet though, but back to contenders. In 2022 this team continued to rule the scene. They literally won all 4 tournaments in 2022, both Summer Series tournaments in the JOTS meta, the Run It Back tournament in Kiriko Lucio, and most recently the Global Pacific Showdown tournament. They are currently on a 6-tournament win streak. They've 6-peated, back-to-back titles. Absolutely insane. Never in contenders history have we seen a team dominate like them. Although some of the other teams I've mentioned on the list went nearly undefeated, O2 Blast are literally undefeated. In 2022 the team did not lose a single contenders match. Absolutely insane. And to quickly list off all the players that have come from that team to the Overwatch League: Violet, Ivy, Stella, Yakpung, Roki, Hailey, Rain, Tuba, My Unbong, Krong, Mandu, Flora, Pelican, Neko, Kalios, Tiru, Chio, Vindame, Finn, Proper, Kilo, although, Merit, Ho1, Max, Bliss, and Hesang, and probably a lot more to come this off-season. So despite Element Mystic and Runaway being better pre-COVID days, the undefeated 2022 season, the currently 6-in-a-row tournament victory win streak, the extremely long list of players who have gone to the Overwatch League, and much more is enough to convince me that O2 Blast earns the title of #1 best Korean contenders team of all time, and not just that, they might also win the title of #1 best contenders team of all time period. They've always just been so stacked, every year. Enough said, but yeah, that just about wraps up my video about the best contenders team of all time from every region. To quickly recap, the best Australian team is Ground Zero Gaming, the best Chinese team is Team CC, the best European team is British Hurricane, the best North American team is American Tornado, and the best Korean team is O2 Blast. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and sub for more, and until next time, have a wonderful new year.